the invitation to share with you today some of the research that we've been conducting here at BlessingWhite, specifically around the challenges of leading expert employees and technical employees. The information that I'm going to share with you today is taken from a research report that we published just a couple of years ago. And since we published the research report, we've been working hands-on with organizations around the world to turn the insights and the findings into learning events and to training events for technical managers to really improve their leadership capabilities. So I'm going to share with you some of the highlights, some of the details from the research today. I would encourage you to download a copy of the research if you're interested. The URL is down here at the bottom of your screen, blessingwhite.com/research. And I'll share with you my contact details as well, so if you do need to ask me any questions, please feel free to do so. And now I've selected the highlighter. Here we go. As Mr. Jeffrey was kind enough to introduce me, I am the head of leadership practice here at BlessingWhite. And I did author the research report that we will be talking about. But I think what's also interesting to highlight is that prior to joining BlessingWhite, I was the head of e-commerce at GE Healthcare. And in that role, I managed a global team of developers, of software developers, around the world, building e-commerce capability for the life science division. And really, one of the things that I was very interested in looking at in this research is how do we really equip leaders and managers who are faced with this task of bringing together a diverse team of technologists, of experts, people that you bring into a project because they have specific expertise around a particular topic. And how do you really engage them into giving their best and committing at the highest level to the success of a project or the success of, let's say, a team or a division in the organization? So that really was my approach in developing this particular body. So a quick agenda for our conversation today. I'm going to walk you through what we mean when we say technical professionals. And I might use some different terms here. We often call these people smart doers, people who are working hands-on in very cerebral and in intellectual pursuit inside the organization. And then we'll talk about the specific challenges that these individuals face when we move them from an individual contributor role, where they can focus almost exclusively on the technology or the discipline that they are experts in. When we move them from that role into a leadership role or a management role, what challenges do they face? And I will wrap up by describing how we learned from this exercise, from the research, in designing much more effective ways of training and developing technical people to take on such a leadership role. So with that said, let me dive straight in. Why are technical people important in organizations today? Why are they increasingly important? Well, I think if we were just to take some perspective and look back at what organizations need first, where do organizations get their competitive advantage? And if we go back to the good old days of the Industrial Revolution, what we find is that really organizations got competitive advantage from being able to bring to the table two main things. One was capital, to be able to buy equipment, plants, manufacturing capabilities. And secondly was a source of relatively cheap and not necessarily highly educated labor. So we saw that during the whole Industrial Revolution. Those were really the countries and the parts of the world that did very well in bringing those two together. But then, let's say in the 70s and 80s, we entered the era of the information age. And in the information age, owning the production capabilities was not really a great source of competitive advantage. In fact, that's when we started to see a lot of outsourcing of manufacturing. And we saw the evolution of a global system because the information age brought much better logistics, much better scientific management approaches, And it wasn't so much the access to the capital and the labor as to market intelligence and the ability to improve production that really drove competitive advantage. But even that phase moved on, and we're now in what we might refer to as the human age. And this is a term that I would credit to Manpower, who socialized the idea that this is an era where human talent is really the biggest competitive differentiator. Now, why is that? Well, today the capital markets are very fluid. If we look at the ups and downs of the financial markets in recent times, we might think that it's a little bit too fluid at times. Labor itself is very mobile. Education levels are increasing around the world as governments and societies invest more heavily in education. And so what we're finding is that competitive advantage in today's environment is really coming from the engagement, the dedication of very smart individuals who work inside organizations to solve the biggest problems that customers are facing. And the organizations that are able to do that at the fastest pace and in the smartest possible way are the ones that are really developing competitive advantage. So this is, from the organization's perspective, why we are seeing a greater dependence on creative people, very smart technical people, people who are really able to apply themselves and deploy that discretionary effort to moving the organization forwards. But if we look at it from the employees' perspective, we find that they are also supporting this trend. Here is some data from the United States, and it's just a nice longitudinal study in the US of how individuals, as well as governments, have increasingly invested in education. So we might see that going from roughly let's say when I was born here around 1970 somewhere, we might have had less than half of the population that had a high school or university degree. But today we find that 1 in 3 employees in the United States hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and many more than half of the population actually achieved high school. Now, if I were to transfer that over and take a look at, for instance, the workforce in Saudi Arabia today, we find that it's essentially, the same kind of distribution. There's a bit of a gap, but at the academic or over level, we have 31% of the population here who have invested heavily in their education and are able to bring that level of knowledge and expertise to the workplace. So at a broad level, that's what we're seeing, right? Heavy investment in education. And what it means is that our workforces are coming into the world of work with different expectations because they've invested so much of their formative years in becoming expert in specific fields. So what fields am I talking about? There's probably some immediate ones that come to mind. You might think about petrochemical engineers. You might think about designers. You could think about financial experts, financial analysts in banking, in investment, software developers, network engineers. All of these kind of hard technical fields are all fields where we depend increasingly on having expertise inside organizations. But what we're also finding now is that even in domains which aren't necessarily the ones we think of immediately as technical, we're also finding that people are investing themselves in becoming expert in specific fields, specific narrow domains. So you might think about marketing, and online marketing is now a discipline where we have people who have vested themselves very heavily in becoming experts in, for example, pay-per-click marketing or lead generation. And these are individuals whose value add comes from bringing that expertise into the organization. And what we find these individuals have is really not just a lot of knowledge, but they also have strong views about how their work should be done. And they prefer a high degree of control in how they're going to accomplish the tasks that they're given. So that's sort of a broad definition here of technical professionals. What we also find is that creatives, people say maybe in advertising, people who do product design, also very much follow the same rules in terms of how they behave in the workplace. So with this broad brush definition for you of what we mean by technical professionals, maybe I'll just give you a minute to think through, for your organization, who would be your technical professionals? And I'm sure you have a picture, depending on the business that you're in, the roles that you see around your organization, that you'll have some individuals who very much fall into this definition of technical professional. So while it's very tempting to think about technical professionals in terms of functional roles, I think where it becomes very interesting in organizational development, in leadership training, is when we study the needs of these individuals in the workplace. And this is really the heart of the research that we have conducted. The research I mentioned at the beginning is one in a series of research reports that we have published starting in the early 1980s around what differentiates the workplace needs of technical engineering and creatives versus a more general workforce. And I'm going to summarize it for you here in 6 workplace needs that in these studies really stand out when we're looking at technical and creative employees. The first workplace need is a sense of achievement. And what we mean by that is that if I'm bringing a certain expertise to the workplace, I expect to be challenged. I expect the organization to lean on my expertise and to put me in on projects or in a work environment where I'm going to be able to shine through the application of my knowledge, and I'm going to be able to operate at the edge of my knowledge, meaning that I am challenged in problem solving day to day. And we find that if technical and expert employees are well led, they will stay up all night. They will fully engage in the work because it's the work itself that they find challenging, and they really are driven by an internal sense of achievement. The next need that we find to be very strong is that while smart doers, while these expert employees do crave self-management and independence, they are really motivated by the nature of the work. So they do prefer a high level of discretion and control over both their work conditions, the pace of the work, and which solutions they will bring to bear, how they will go about finding the solutions, and how they will work on a particular problem in order to solve it. The next topic is an interesting one. It's what we call professional identification. Professional identification means that smart doers identify with their field of interest or their profession first, and your organization second. So, for example, I recently worked with a group of leaders from an energy company, and we talked about their need for professional identification. One of the leaders stood up and said, I'm a toxicologist first. And that really was the field of expertise that that individual felt closest to. And the idea that they would in any way deviate from that field of study, even if it meant taking on a different role in the organization, that clearly wasn't an option for them. That's really where they wanted to develop. So we have to find a sweet spot between these expert employees maintaining their professional identification and how we deploy resources onto projects or how we plan people's careers going forwards. The next one is participation in the mission and goals. And what we found is that these are very smart individuals. They don't just want to know where the organization is going. They want to understand the logic behind it. So too often, we find that senior leaders are reticent from engaging, whether it's in a public forum, maybe through online tools, engaging with these technical populations. They sort of assume that they are in the lab or they're in the field or they're working on some engineering or technical creative problem, that they shouldn't be disrupted or interrupted, and that they're probably not all that interested in understanding the business logic. But quite the contrary, these are individuals who really have a thirst for knowing what path the organization is on and the thinking, the logic behind that. Technical and expert employees obviously crave collegial support and sharing. And this is something that organizations can often do a better job at in terms of creating opportunities for experts to connect with others in the same field, whether it's inside the organization or outside the organization. So creating those opportunities to attend conferences, to join on online webinars or seminars such as this one. These are all great ways of not just improving the knowledge inside your organization, but also feeding the thirst that your expert employees have for staying ahead in their field. Which sort of brings us to the last point here, which is keeping current. This plays out in many different ways inside a team. So imagine that you have a great opportunity to develop and launch a new product, which is going to rely on the skills and expertise of your staff. However, at the same time, you have 5 or 6 other projects which are maybe a bit more mundane. How are you going to decide who on your team is going to get this opportunity to really work at the cutting edge, to stay current in their skills, and how are you going to decide who stays on the more mundane projects? And this takes us to some of the challenges that these individuals are going to face when they take on leadership roles. So as I mentioned, these are 6 of the needs which really stood out when we did more of a psychometric study of an overall workforce, and then we studied separately those who come from a technical or engineering background or creative background versus more general employees. You know, and by general I mean employees who maybe have advanced degrees, but they may have done a degree in an arts degree and then eventually gotten into more of a business role. They seem to be less vested in their role than those who, from the start, invested themselves heavily in a particular discipline. So we have all of these smart employees in your organization, and they are all presumably doing good work and moving things forward. The real challenge is this. As I mentioned, you have a team of 10, 12 technical experts in a particular area. Maybe it's experts in your financial group, or maybe it's experts in a hedge fund. One of them is going to have to get promoted to manage their peers at some point. And we find this transition to be quite challenging for most expert employees. The reason is simply that up to this point, the way they've added value is simply through deep domain expertise, through their knowledge. And now we're suddenly asking them to take on the human dynamics, the human elements of leadership. And when technical experts do, we find that they can fall into more specific pitfalls, they face more specific challenges than other employees do. So let me walk you through some of the top challenges that we've found. The first thing that may happen is you may take a young technical expert and put them into a leadership role. They're very pleased to have taken it on. We've discussed all of the objectives, their new accountability as a leader. You come back 2 months later and you find that really all they've done is that they stayed in their comfort zone. In England, the expression we use for that is to stick to their knitting. Right? It's what they know how to do. They were really actually quite pleased, or they felt much more comfortable sticking to the expert area that they were deeply vested in. So now you have a team which is effectively leaderless, and you have a leader who is spending actually most of their time just working on stuff and not providing the leadership, the management that the team requires. So that is the first pitfall that we find. Despite setting the expectations, there's more encouragement that is needed to get an expert employee to be an effective leader. The second challenge we find is sort of the opposite. The new leader decides, okay, I'm going to really take this role on. I'm going to start leading and managing this broader team of other expert employees. And they use the tools that they're very familiar with. And those are project management tools. So you can now imagine one manager trying to project manage 12 or 20 other people. And so they end up spending a lot of time in turnstile type project reviews. Every time somebody on the team wants to make a decision or move to the next phase, they have to wait for the leader to review everything. And eventually what you end up with is that this manager, this leader really isn't managing anything. They themselves end up swamped by detail. They burn out eventually, and they also burn out because they are facing a lot of resistance and pushback from the other experts on their team. Going back to those 6 workplace needs, remember the high importance of autonomy it's very, very tiring for a leader to be trying to micromanage people on the team because of the pushback they're going to get. The next thing they can experience is a tug of war. I mentioned this a little bit in the workplace needs with that scenario of the exciting project versus the mundane project. New leaders and even tenured leaders of technical and expert teams are going to find this time and time again. They are going to be faced with the challenge of great opportunities to learn new things, to work on the most exciting projects, maybe to work with outside firms on a partnership. And not only are they going to have to decide who on their team they promote into those roles, but they are also going to be tempted to keep those development opportunities for themselves. And if they do that too often, the people on their team are going to resent them for not sharing these opportunities because they are few and far between. But if they do it too seldom, then they're depriving themselves of a lot of the things that bring them satisfaction in the work. And of course, they're going to feel that they are falling behind in their own technical knowledge, which could be limiting in their ability to lead the team. So that's what we mean by this tug of war of finding the right balance when you are juggling these development opportunities. And the fourth challenge I'll mention is micromanagement. And this is interesting because when you ask a technical expert or a creative expert what they hate the most in their workplace, they'll often say it's a boss that micromanages them. I mean, if you know how to do something, there's nothing worse than somebody breathing down your neck, telling you step by step how something has to be done. And yet, when we take those same people and we put them into management roles, by what they seem to infer from the promotion is that they are the smartest person on the team. And therefore, the way that they do things is the way that everybody else should be doing something. So it becomes a case of my way or the highway. And we find that even though they hate being micromanaged, the first thing they'll do once they're given a management or leadership role is to start micromanaging others on their team. So another pitfall, which is very common and one that we need to address. So there's a few other challenges that I could detail for you, which these technical experts tend to fall into. But maybe more interestingly, organizations have always faced this type of challenge. But while technical teams were sort of in the background, the IT team was somewhere in the back of the office dealing with the email server and keeping the ERP system running, the challenges were not so visible. But now that expert employees are fundamental to the success of every department, from finance to marketing to sales to the technology aspect, if you have poor leadership in those teams, the implications are much more visible and much more damaging. So you might see some things such as lack of participation and innovation. That could be certainly one of the challenges if you have a team that's micromanaged. But you're also seeing more long-term issues, such as the lack of future development or technology stagnation inside the organization. Ultimately, having a bad leader in a technology team can also mean that you end up with turnover. So if you're promoting people who are very good technologists but not very good people leaders, there's a risk that you're going to lose a lot of the other talent on the team. And of course, in the long term, what you're going to find is that lower development speeds, more friction inside the technology groups, less commitment and engagement is going to result in a longer time to market for any new development, whether it's an internal innovation or an external product innovation for your customers. So these are really the challenges that a lot of our clients are expressing. And we've worked with some of the world's leading technology firms. Interestingly enough, a lot of the clients that worked with us around this are in the microelectronics space, quite a few in the energy space, quite a lot in the software space. And these are clients who we've partnered with over the last 10 and 20 years to develop these leadership programs for these expert employees in their organizations. More recently, we've been working also with advertising firms, as I mentioned, and we're finding these very strong parallels in terms of the behaviors of these expert employees, what their expectations are on what good leadership looks like. So diving into the research itself, I'm going to walk you through some of the numbers from the research that we published. We did sample over 900 leaders, but we also looked at individual contributors to understand what they wanted from their leaders, and we juxtaposed that with what learning and development professionals were seeing. And it's interesting to juxtapose the three. As you'll see, it allows us to highlight some gaps. The respondents, still typically male in technical environments. We found the population here in our own survey at least to be particularly to be younger than your average workforce. And we do find them coming from all kinds of industries and all kinds of departments. Of course, some departments are heavily populated with expert employees, some less so, but we do find technical or expert employees in pretty much in every department. And as I mentioned, they do tend to be very well educated compared to the population at large. So the first question we were interested in digging into is, what are the top leadership challenges that you face? And we juxtapose that particularly with what learning and development were focused on in organizations. What were the assumptions learning and development were making when they were developing training courses or development initiatives for these people? So I'm going to share with you quite a lot of data, and I'll try and explain it. It's all in the research report, so please forgive me if I go through this a bit quickly. But we really stacked up what are the top challenges that these technical leaders face. So as you'll see here, really delivering on projects with fewer resources, always a challenge. But then what we found, interestingly, were there were a lot of challenges around recruiting, developing, and essentially fostering the talent on the team, while at the same time coaching the team to higher levels of performance alongside doing your own project responsibilities. So the first theme that we found is that attracting, developing, retaining talent is at top of the list of most of these leaders, but they are also very hurried people. They don't have much time to spare. And I guess like most of us today, you know, their hair is on fire and they have many projects on the go. So let's see where learning and development landed on this. And the first thing I would point out is there's actually very poor correlation here between all of these items. Learning and development seems to have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to the actual needs that these leaders have. In fact, if we look at what learning and development placed top, again, if you can see that the leaders ranked these items pretty low. So developing yourself personally and professionally, not ranking very highly for these leaders. So that could be a blind spot that we might need to address, because they do actually need some opportunities for development if you want to retain them in the long term. And these ideas around encouraging the team during times of change, uncertainty, ambiguity, even though learning and development thought that was really high, I think change is such a constant in organizations today, it is not seen as such a priority for the leaders. So that's the first takeaway, is that we have this big gap between the leadership challenges that leaders are facing and what learning and development is typically focused on. So next we asked both individual contributors, the leaders, and learning and development, what is important for a leader of technical people to be effective, and also what does your manager need to be better at? So I'm going to share with you a lot of data on the next slide. Not to scare you, I'm going to walk you through it, and I apologize if this is a bit hard to read. But if you just follow through with me here, I'll highlight this a little bit for you. So the first thing to mention is, unlike the leadership challenges, when it comes to what skills should be developed, you'll find that there's actually pretty good agreement here between the individual contributors, the managers, and learning and development around what really are the priorities. But let me highlight a few of the gaps. If you ask individual contributors what they would like their manager to be more effective at, you're going to find that the topics all revolve around what they could do for that individual contributor on the team. So coaching and developing, and giving specific and relevant feedback. Now, I would draw your eye over here to the numbers given to these items by the manager, pretty low, really, and even learning and development are not seeing that that's an area managers need to develop. And yet, it's the top items that the people on their team will consistently request. So an area of focus when you develop leaders in technical teams. So where are the managers focused? Well, a couple of areas, as we can see here, building a reputation for the leader and the team throughout the organization. Of course, the individual contributors don't see this. They're not ranking this particularly high, nor is learning and development. But the managers are expressing a strong need. They're asking for support, both in terms of what would make them successful and where they need to develop. They're saying, this is an area I need to get better at. And the other area is, I need to have better skills or better ways of encouraging employees to take initiative in solving problems. This is still a challenge for the managers. They want to be equipped around this particular topic. Of course, individual contributors aren't going to say that they need encouragement, right? They think they're doing fine. And even learning and development don't tend to prioritize something that specific. What we do tend to all focus on, and we all agree on this, is that really to be a good manager in this environment, you need to be able to build trust with the team. Trust is the foundation of really good leadership. And you need to be able to communicate effectively, not just within the group, but you also have to explain what your technical team does to the rest of the organization. So I hope this is really drawing some interesting points out for you in terms of where we will focus our efforts if we really want to develop effective leaders. So these are really the areas that were highlighted: building trust, communicating effectively, fostering collaboration, and also delegation skills, which tie back to creating good autonomy in the team, setting clear goals and giving effective feedback, but without falling into the challenge or the pitfall of micromanaging. And this just highlights some of the items that I mentioned: the importance of coaching and quality feedback, and the importance of building reputation with the teams. Again, all of this is in the research report. If you want to dig in deeper, I'd encourage you to take a look there. So then very quickly, what we also looked at is learning preferences. I mean, it helps to know that technical professionals, not only do they have specific workplace needs, they also have specific learning preferences. We find that they really value short burst learning sessions, which is not what learning and development tends to think. We tend to think that it's good for these folks to sit in a class for 2 days or 3 days. They're very smart individuals, they're book smart, they're used to studying over long periods of time. Well, guess what? That's not really true. There also are hurried managers with a lot of pressure on them. So when it comes to learning, we have to make this short, digestible, high impact. When we look at technology, while many of them have access to smartphones or computers or tablets, they really don't favor them when it comes to learning. They really would rather just use technology to get tips and tricks, maybe read articles. But one of the things that really turns technical people off, and even creatives off when it comes to learning, is the idea of introducing social learning. The idea of gamification sometimes, or the idea of learning from each other when it comes to soft skills is really not an area that technical professionals tend to go to. So digging a little bit deeper into this idea of what is your preferred learning method, there's a few things I'll highlight here. Again, we wanted to understand what's the best way to reach these individuals. So again, people really love web pages, reading books and articles to learn something new. But there were, again, some gaps which inform our design of leadership initiatives. And the first one is this: when you transition from being an individual contributor to being a manager, suddenly the ability to get into a class, work with a facilitator, and in particular, to interact with your peers becomes much more important, as you can see in this big jump. So that's one thing that technical leaders really appreciate, is the ability to get out of the workplace for short bursts of time and to get feedback from their peers on how they are tackling some of these challenges. We see that the use of videos also is not generally something that learning and development will turn to, but managers and individual contributors are quite open to learning through videos if they are short, socialize the concepts, and give them quick access to the information. And finally, one thing that's really kind of played out through all of our research is that there is a stigma in technical environments when it comes to asking for help from your manager or your mentor. There is a real stigma for technical people about putting your hand up and saying, hey, I don't know how to do this. And so this is a challenge that we need to address if we want these managers, these leaders, to seek help from, particularly from their boss. That's not normally a channel that they would turn to. So we have to make that easy for them, kind of risk-free, as we design these learning initiatives. So I'm going to bring all of this together, right? The leadership challenges that expert employees face, the pitfalls that they can fall into, the way they like to learn, and in particular, those skills that I highlighted, which we see as gaps often. As I mentioned, we've been working with technical organizations, creative organizations, in designing more effective leadership programs. And the program that we've developed, the one that we commercialize, is called Leading Technical People. And I just want to walk through our thinking behind the design of that program. It will probably inform your own efforts if you're a leader of other technical people, just in terms of how you craft a good development initiative for this population. And it really starts with the realization that traditional instructor-led training, when you do one event, you're able to kind of boost people's knowledge. You're able to get their level of expertise up. But it doesn't last all that long. We find that particularly if the skills are not practiced and reinforced over time, that retention is lost pretty rapidly. And there's lots of really good research around how to make learning stick and how traditional instructor-led training, if it isn't reinforced in the workplace, actually decreases pretty rapidly. So the model that we always build around is one of continuous learning. So how do we get people up high on the expert scale and maintain that? How do you sustain it? Well, it generally involves a number of touch points, starting with socializing concepts. I mentioned videos are a good channel for this if they are short bursts. They socialize a concept. They allow people to get used to it before we bring them in to a prepared session. So first we will have individuals do pre-work, get peer feedback, get input from other people. This preparation work is really quite important because you want to bring people into an instructor-led, short burst instructor-led sessions, having thought through how these particular challenges, the ones that I mentioned, like building trust and communicating or delegating, how do these actually play out today in their team? How are others viewing this leader's ability to handle those kind of situations? So that there's already an imperative, but there's also real live case studies that the person will bring with them, their actual personal leadership challenges. And this is what we will use as a foundation to explore and practice these skills. So it's immediately relevant for that leader because they are working with live ammunition, as we say, working with their own particular challenges. But then to avoid this crash, as you can see on the gray line, then it's important to have a number of ways of sustaining that learning. Now, most of the reinforcement, of course, will happen on the job. But we do find, going back to the sticking to your knitting type behavior that I described, that unless we have ways of creating good dialogue between that leader and their manager to provide support, if we provide peer communities, if we provide follow-up webinars, all of these channels all add up to sustaining that learning over time. And in terms of the skills themselves, we really make sure that when the leaders come into the class, that the topics that they will be exploring are the ones that are the most pressing for them. And so working with clients, what we will tend to do is have a suite of different leadership challenges or areas that you can explore. We build those as modules so that you can pick, either as an organization or maybe even for specific cohorts of leaders that you're training, you can focus on very specific items. So we have some clients, for example, that do an assessment beforehand, and they say, you know what, the building trust piece, we're good. We've done surveys. We know we have good trust level in the team. We're going to focus a little bit less on that, but we might focus more on how we do questioning and active listening, because these are core skills that all these leaders need to acquire in order to then work on these real-world situations, such as how do you give feedback, how do you handle resistance on the team, maybe you have teams that work virtually, and we can really dive deeper then into these topics which are specific to that learning audience. So today really was just a quick 40-minute fly through of this research. Again, the research is found at blessingwhite.com/research. But just to summarize really what we covered today, just to reinforce that the organizations that we work in, not only are they heavily dependent on technical people today, we only see that dependency getting stronger as each domain seems to become more and more of an area of expertise, and as people invest more and more heavily in their own education. We also find that these leaders of technical people, they do face these specific pitfalls. They do tend to be specific to technical and expert environments. And organizations are increasingly aware of this challenge. And that's why we really need to agree on the skills and the competencies that technical people need to develop, and take into consideration these learning preferences when you do design learning initiatives for these folks. So with that summary, that quick summary in place, I will turn this back to Mr. Jaffrey and invite any questions you might have at this point. I'm using my contact details.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Marlow. Folks, we are open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you can put it in the question box, or you can raise your hand. There is a hand icon on the console, so if you click on it, I will give you an opportunity to speak to Mr. Marlow. Let me go straight to the caller who has raised his hand. We have Brother Mahmoud Sharaf. Brother, you've raised your hand. Could you please introduce and ask the question?
The question is that in the healthcare industry, the learning process is really complicated. Now, the scope of work of hospital is always, giving the chance for the learning curve to increase for all the staff. Do you agree that, everyone should, be part of the learning process initiative design, or it is only the responsibility of leaders? I'm sorry, I did not introduce myself. My name is Mahmoud Sharaf. I'm the General Director for Dr. Sulaiman Habib Hospital in Qasim, Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much for the question. I think within organizations today, learning is everybody's business. I think if you have leaders or senior managers who aren't committed to seeing learning across the board in an organization, that organization will fall pretty rapidly behind. I mean, in the healthcare industry in particular, technology is evolving so quickly. The discipline is advancing so quickly that large hospital networks that fail to invest in their staff pretty rapidly find that they are highlighted because they're not using the latest technologies or the latest practices. We're learning so much day to day. As I mentioned at the beginning, I used to work with GE Healthcare, so I'm familiar with the pace at which medical staff at any level have to stay current. So yes, I think it's, I completely agree that it is incumbent on leadership to make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to learn. Here I'm talking specifically about the challenges of technical leaders in managing other people, and a large part of that is creating the opportunities for everybody within the nursing staff, within the medical staff, to get the training, both on the soft skills side, so that people can work well and work effectively as teams, but also on the technical side to stay current. Mhm. Maybe I'll give you another quick example of an organization I worked with recently, and they manufacture airplanes, and these are private jets. And when you make a private jet, you have a large team of people working on it, and you have one person who has to be a certified aeronautical engineer. And it's very difficult to keep an aeronautical engineer who is deeply vested in that discipline, whose passion is about designing and planning the construction of planes. Very hard to keep them engaged when they are having to operate a manufacturing line, especially when it's the night shift. And we find that as well in hospitals, that sometimes part of the challenge is how do you balance the workload when some of it is working on the cutting edge, doing those procedures which really demand expertise and investment. But you also have a lot of work which is more day-to-day, 24/7, and keeping the staff motivated and engaged. Sometimes the opportunity to develop new skills is one way of keeping people's commitment and to keeping people's level of engagement. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brother Shira, for this question. Let me move to the question box. Why exactly would technical professionals have different learning needs than non-technical people?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not just learning needs, but also workplace behaviors is often a question we get. Right? Those 6 workplace needs, why would they be different? And I think particularly early in their careers, what we find is that people who are deeply vested in a technical environment may have spent 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, maybe more in formal education, and the way in which they bring value is through this deep domain expertise. So they arrive into the organization with very strong skills in terms of acquiring new knowledge, and they have spent they've invested a lot of their lives in acquiring and applying new information and new knowledge. And so we find that population actually to be quite different than, let's say, people who came in, maybe did a history degree and is now working in a sales role. That person isn't really bringing all of that history knowledge. That's not why the organization brought them in, and therefore they have a bit more of a blank slate in terms of their openness to the company guiding them, right? The company teaching them the skills around sales, around business, around those more general topics. But if you bring in an expert employee, they come with a lot more preconceived ideas around how to acquire skill. How, they're very smart people, so they know what channels they prefer to go to acquire skills, and they have very formed ideas in terms of how the work should be done. I can't tell you the number of arguments I've had within IT teams when we have tried to pick what technology platform we're going to build the next application on. And some people are passionate about .asp, and some people are passionate about PHP, and some people are passionate about Java. They have their own domain of expertise. They've learned it, and their way of acquiring skills and bringing technology to the table means that you end up with a lot of these arguments and very strong opinions, which you as a leader have to deal with. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Another one. Which technical leaders, renowned technical leaders that you admire, and for which leadership skills you admire?
So the leaders that I personally admire, the ones I would say are role models. Is that the question? Yeah. I think I think one of the challenges actually, here's a real challenge when it comes to putting individuals on a pedestal in this conversation. I've often been asked, well, take somebody like Steve Jobs. Now, Steve Jobs, actually, if you look at his education, wasn't a technical expert, but he is somebody who, obviously an overachiever in terms of what he built in his lifetime, And these are the kind of people that that are often highlighted, or I mean, in any particular discipline, in medicine or in bioscience, even in finance, you have people who succeed and become very senior leaders and are highlighted for their expertise. But the challenge is that, you know, those individuals often have very difficult personalities, very strong egos, and when you actually get to interview the people who have worked alongside them, they've burnt a lot of people out. They didn't get the, I mean, they got the best results in the big picture, but often the skills that people look for in an immediate manager or an immediate leader are not these kind of, you know, superhero or the ones that have made the headlines. A little bit the same in politics, we find sometimes, right? So I think rather than point at individuals and say, you know, these are people who are great leaders, particularly in the technical domain, they might be great visionaries, they might be great leaders of organizations. But the people that are most admired, in fact, we often do this exercise when we're training leaders. We ask people, you know, who was the best coach or the best leader you've ever had? And invariably, it's somebody who is actually pretty close to them, much more of a mentor, somebody who had a lot of faith in the individual and believed that that individual could achieve more than they themselves believed. But I would probably shy away from the idea of, you know, naming names and saying these are particular engineers who are, you know, who are experts. And in particular, because when it comes to leadership, we often encourage people to, rather than pick a role model and try and emulate that role model, to focus more on what their own personal strengths are and to develop them around, you know, these topics that we talked about, you know, around getting these things right, like giving feedback and inspiring innovation and working closely with their team on these topics. So I hope it doesn't sound like I'm avoiding the question, but I do think it's a bit dangerous just to pick a role model and try and behave like them.
Thank you very much. And we have one last question. How do you address the challenge of organizations where technical people are not listened to as much as the commercial staff?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting going between organizations. You can find 2 or 3 organizations in the same space. So let's say, you know, they're developing web applications or even companies that develop new hardware. And you go into one organization and the sales team is driving the bus. And the engineers are all sitting in the back of the bus, and it's the sales team that says, this is what we need, these are the specs we need, clients want this. And then you can go to another organization in the same business, and you actually find that it's the engineers driving the bus, and the sales role is diminished. And it's the engineers who come up with the great creative ideas, and they say to the sales team, look, this is what we've designed, you go, you know, you go and make sure that the clients are buying it. And you see this as well in professional services quite a bit, consulting. You see that quite a lot. So I think if you are in a situation where the sales team have strong opinions or the senior management team have strong opinions about where they want to go, and you have a divide with the engineering or the technical team and they're not listening, then I think you need to address that really at a leadership level. What you often find is that technical leaders build silos. They focus much more on the technology, and they create this sort of us and them culture. So you end up with this rift happening in the organization where the technical leaders are saying to their teams, look, we understand this domain of expertise. Those guys, you know, the suits who do the selling understand nothing about this. And there's a lot of pushback when the requests come through. So I think the only way you can really tackle that is at a leadership level. So you need to get the senior leadership team to put that on the table as a topic. You need to look at the needs of technical professionals, including the leaders, right? The senior leaders, the chief technology officer. Acknowledge that these people are very smart, that they bring a lot of value to the table, and really work from both sides to create much more of a team to give a voice, because usually when you get that pushback, it's because the technical teams don't have a voice. And again, I'm tempted here to jump back to my slide of the needs of technical people. Here we go. So if you think through on that, you know, the achievement is being pushed down because the technical team isn't given the chance to challenge themselves in moving things forward. They're told by the sales team what to do. All their autonomy has been taken away because the sales team is now, you know, telling them exactly what they have to build, so they have no autonomy. Their professional identification is being violated because even though they're the experts and they know all about this, that isn't being honored, right? The sales team is telling them what to do. So you could essentially go through this list as a team and say, how do we engage our technical people into that dialogue? Make sure that it's not just a unilateral demand from the sales team. And generally, you'll find that the pushback, the thing we often see happen is that these discussions become a technical argument. You might be experiencing this. The technical team are coming back with all these good technical reasons of why it's the wrong decision. But when you peel that back, it's not really a technical discussion that's taking place. It is really a discussion around honoring the input of the technical folks and addressing them much more on an emotional level of making sure that you respect them and that you're bringing them into that conversation. But it does take work from both sides, and your technical leaders have to be adept at not building barriers, not building walls, but being part of the conversation.
Thank you very much. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. We really want to thank you, Mr. Marlow, for the time. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Thank you very much, and thank you to Madinah for the invitation. Mr. Jeffrey, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, and I want to thank you on behalf of Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship again for your time and for this valuable information that you presented and illustrated in this live webinar. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording this webinar. It will be uploaded on Mile Community, so please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to access our archives and equally to sign up for our upcoming webinars. With that note, I will conclude and end this webinar, so you all will be automatically dismissed out. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.